Journey in Kenya so far, we want to take a look at some numbers just to get a sense of what that path has been like. Now, it will take 135 years to close the gender parity gap in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, efforts to close it have become elusive. Despite concerted efforts to narrow the gap, Kenya still ranks 114 out of 153 on the Global Gender Gap Index when it comes to economic participation and opportunities for women. Let's take a look at where we are in terms of the gender space in this country. In the political arena in 2017, Parliament had 3 women elected and 18 nominated to the Senate, 3 women elected as governors, 98 women elected as members of the County Assembly, while 599 were nominated in fulfillment of the 2/3 gender principle at the county level. But even with such progress, women take up 172 out of the 1,883 elected seats. Now, let's move over to other sectors which fared much better, with women's accounting for 57% of all practicing lawyers, 49% of magistrates, 41% of high court judges, 36% of county commissioners, and 33% of members of county assemblies, and 31% of senators, as we showed earlier. Now, on the wage gap, female workers earn 68 shillings for every 100 shillings their male counterparts are paid, while men earn more than women in all sectors except in international organizations which have parity at this point. In the private sector, the median salary for women is 83% that of men. In the national government, it is 79%, and in the county governments, it sits at 56%. When it comes to higher learning, 2 in 5 university students are women. And on our farmlands, 4 in 5 farm laborers are women. Well, women also manage 40% of the country's smallholder farms, yet they own just 1% of the agricultural land and access only 10% of farm credit. Now, it's clear that we have a ways to go. And this year's theme, I Am Generation Equality, encourages women to take stock of the past efforts, and it is in part a call to action to engage all generations in this quest. Well, I sat down with 3 generations of women and a man to talk about gender equality journey so far. Take a look. We are here at the Mugs and Brews restaurant at Marsabit Plaza. Our guests today are Irungu Houghton, the Amnesty International Kenya Executive Director. He is widely known as an inspirational speaker, change facilitator, and skillful moderator. Honorable Julia Ojambo is a veteran politician and a scholar. She was the first woman to be appointed as an assistant minister in Kenya. Kate Maina Vorley is the country director for Plan International Kenya, an organization that advances children's rights and equality for girls. Joanne Kuria is a communications and policy specialist who is passionate about dismantling economic and gender inequalities on the African continent. All right, thank you all for joining me and having this discussion. You know, when we talk about women's issues, gender equality, feminism, oftentimes they have such negative connotations. But this is a huge gender year, 2020. And I'd like to kind of go back a bit, Honorable Ojambo, before we kind of take a look at where we are in terms of this journey. You are a pioneer when it comes to gender issues in this country, in this region. If you can think back on some of the key issues, you know, that you were fighting for back in the 60s and 70s, what were those then when you make that comparison?
In those early days, we were fighting for a voice, just a voice to be heard. Because that's when there was this belief that the woman's place was in the kitchen. So you cooked and brought food to the front, placed food on the table, and then disappeared in the back. I was not able to attend barazas, public barazas, where you could speak out on issues. Developmental issues were left to the men who attended barazas. And also even at a family level, you know, the elders came together as men and discussed. And women were in their group and the men were in their group. So where major decisions were taking place, women were not there. So our concern was therefore, how do we get to the front? We are also now becoming increasingly aware of the fact that sooner or later, countries would win independence. And would we ever be able to talk about it?
Incredible, and Rungu, I'll come to you, but Kate, let me get your take, because that fight would shift and evolve with time. Women, yes, have a voice to some extent now. We see women leaders holding very powerful positions. But when you're looking at, say, the decades of the 80s, 90s, what were the key issues then that you observed?
I think I would say because of a lot of the efforts of noble women like Honorable Julia Ojambo, a lot was realized. We did see an uptake in education for girls. I think I am a testimony of that. In my household, we didn't have a conversation that my brother could go to school and I should stay at home. So I think we saw the fruits of that. But the conversation has evolved. We're now talking about issues of access remain an issue, but it's been now compounded by several nuances, especially around socio-cultural norms and practices. They continue to underpin what drives gender inequality in many countries across the globe, and particularly in Kenya. And we see that. I mean, my own personal story, gone to school, some of the best schools in Kenya. I've gotten a good education. But somewhere along the way, you see the manifestation of harmful social, cultural and practices. That we could even have a debate in my home that I do not have rights to inherit my father's property. So a well-educated family, but we're still talking about land rights. Should girls own land? Should girls have equal access to their parents' inheritance? So the debate has changed and it has morphed. It's also morphed into unpalatable situations around gender-based violence, social, cultural, harmful practices, against girls that actually preposition girls into opportunities where their efforts are being eroded. The work that ladies like Honorable Julia Ojambo, did are being eroded now because we are seeing early child marriages. Let me call it that. There's no early, there's no child. Child marriages are becoming a norm in many communities. We're seeing female genital mutilation. We're seeing gender-based violence. So the game has changed in very subtle ways. And if we do not arrest this, then all the gains will be eroded.
And it's amazing some of the things that you mentioned that in the 21st century we are still having to deal with. Joanne, you represent, for lack of a better term, the feminist of today, right? The modern woman who's looking at, yes, the work of Julia, yes, the concerns of Kate, and now you're thinking, what will my generation do? What will be our mark in this whole gender equality journey? In your view, what would you say are some key issues now?
Wow, just as Honorable Julia said, and as Kate said, every generation sort of seems to pick up from the next generation, and I feel like my generation is now appreciating the gains that we can actually be on the table. We can actually have our voice heard. But I think in many situations, the nuances that you mentioned still creep up. And now in the workplace, we're talking about things like the motherhood penalty, where if you're a mother, there's some penalties that you accrue because you decided to get a child and to leave the workforce. We're talking about gender wage gap, where women are still being paid disproportionately less than their male counterparts for the same amount of work that they do. We're still talking about issues such as menstrual hygiene and health management, which in many cases, why would a girl have to leave school because she can't afford hygienic, sanitary and quality products? And it's interesting because I think at this particular time, 2020, the gender space is perhaps one of the most heavily legislated spaces. So we're not short of legislation. We have an FGM 2011 legislation, but we still have FGM. 1 in 10 girls in Kenya still undergo FGM. We have MHM, menstrual hygiene management, is captured in the Basic Education Act, and there's now a policy that's coming as well. But we still have girls who don't have access, who think about the economics of menstruation. Where am I going to buy sanitary products, or am I going to feed my family? And I love what you said about the cultural nuances, because so often we still thrive in an environment where we still need to get permission.
Yeah.
We still need to get permission either to speak or to be heard. And I always say that if we still have legal frameworks that perpetuate gender inequality, then we must address that. If we have legal frameworks that say women go for 3 months maternity leave and men only do 2 weeks, what are you trying to say about the role of a man in childcare? Are you trying to perpetuate something? If I'll go to an airport like I did recently and find that I don't have a changing station to change my 2-year-old son, what are you trying to say? Where am I supposed to change him? On the concrete floor of the airport? So do policy makers think about this thing? There's a discrepancy between the fact that we are very heavily legislated and the fact that there's very poor implementation in these amazing, robust pieces of legislation. So yeah, I guess that's where the current generation is battling with gender equality.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the whole issue of legislation being there. So yeah, we have laws to kind of govern and give us direction on how to go about these things. But practically speaking, when we're talking about gender equality, we're leaving out half of the team, like Obama had once referred to, the men. And I think somewhere along that journey, we realized we need to have men on board. How do we do that practically, Irungu, for men to see their space, their role when it comes to gender equality? And you mentioned, you know, things like maternity leave, for instance, and we think that's just women. What about the men? You know, or having changing beds in the men's bathroom as well. That is part of the gender equality conversation. But from your perspective, Irungu, how can we get men on board, practically speaking?
The thing that I'm very present to now is that I was essentially socialized to be a protector and to be a provider. What I wasn't socialized to be was to be somebody who's related to all the people in my life, right? And for many, many men, they are in crisis because, you know, they were brought up to be protectors, but then they have these fiercely independent, free-thinking daughters, you know, who don't need to be protected. They are actually staking their claim in their country, and there is a crisis. Or you have men who have been brought up that they must be the authority in the home, and that no longer works, right? So I think one of the things that we have to declare is that the stereotypes that give men this sense of entitlement, this sense of privilege, that actually is false and is no longer helpful in today's age, and that we have to recreate different kinds of relationships.
Let's talk about a segment of the women population that, as much as we've made progress in various areas, gaining their voice, gaining political offices, the women in rural areas are still very much behind. When you look at major indicators, they fall behind significantly. Why does it seem that the change is not being felt there? What could be some of the hindrances?
Yeah, I think it goes back to where these conversations are being had. You know, when I look at the whole conversation and the whole discourse around gender inequality, I think one would argue that there's been at least 2 to 3 decades where globally all governments are talking about gender inequality. And I think one thing to note this year, the theme for International Women's Day is each for equal. So we must also remember that gender inequality in some situations also disfavors men. And so, you know, we tend to think about women, but we also need to recognize that there are opportunities where it disfavors men as well. But back to your issue, there are many things that have to happen for us to achieve gender equality. We must talk to each other, but the talking must also happen at the grassroots. And so, to your point, why would you walk away from a panel? Because there are no women there. But are the conversations happening at the grassroots level? You know, change happens at the grassroots. As much as policies are being, you know, designed and discussed at this national level and being legislated, Kenya is known for having some of the strongest policies, you know, in the world and in the continent particularly. But we're not very good about implementation. So there is a break between policy and implementation. And why is this break happening? Because that discourse is not happening at the grassroots where the rural women exist and actually are living every day the realities of gender inequality. You know, I was looking at data on child marriage just the day before yesterday. It's not a conversation piece, child marriage, for Nairobi, for Eastern Province, and I think Central, but it's a big conversation piece in all the other places. So we need to take the conversations back to the grassroots. We need to remember that Kenya is made up, we're only as good as the sum of all our parts. And if we can't have that conversation down there and recognize that, you know, despite all the best laid policies, if we do not address our cultural practices that hinder gender equality, then I think we're missing the point somewhere.
And it's interesting because it's almost like the story of two different women. So there's a woman in Mashinani, and then there's a woman who's educated in the urban areas. She knows her rights. She's very vocal. And that woman is now a threat to men. And you find a lot of young men saying, we don't know how to handle this new empowered woman.
Yeah.
Joanne, how do you speak to that? Because it's such a different picture when you look at those two different women.
Yeah. So I saw a quote recently that said, gender diversity is inviting somebody to come to the party, but gender inclusion is inviting them to dance at the party. So I think for the longest time ever, even in terms of our policies, we've always thought about gender diversity. That's what inspired having 47 women representatives, where let's have these women. Whether it's tokenism, whether they truly should be there, whether it's in terms of quantity, let's just have the numbers. But when you think about, okay, so we have the numbers. Do we have inequality by having these numbers? And then also, when we have the diversity, it's not equivalent to inclusion. So I think it's when we talk about gender mainstreaming in NGOs and stuff like that, there should be a more in-depth look at what this mainstreaming looks like, so that we're truly having women in every single sphere. And to be honest, I think one of the elements of this gender equality and pushing it further is empathy. You know, it's your ability to lend yourself to somebody else's plight. I give an example of menstrual hygiene management, and for instance, I've never had to think about the cost of sanitary products because I've always been able to afford them. My mother was always able to afford them, but there's somebody that's not their reality. And so even within the gender sphere and even within women, there's all those, you know, it's stratified where gender wage gap is not an issue for you. You know, where being in the STEM industry, the STEM sector is an issue for some people and not the others. So I think holistic conversations on gender equality, what does gender equality look like? What does gender diversity and inclusion look like? Including men. I think for the longest time ever, we've always, and many times because feminism has gotten a bad rep for being a male emasculative agenda. And I mean, it really isn't. Somebody called me yesterday and asked me, is there such a thing as balanced feminism? And I'm like, no, because feminism in itself is balanced.
Yeah.
It's just that perhaps along the way it's been hijacked and the definition has sort of like taken a male emasculative agenda where we want what you have. We want, and it's not that, it's just that feminism is not about women, it's about equality. And it's interesting because the definition, gender equality, for some reason we always think women.
Exactly. Yeah, or just gender, we think women.
Yes,
Yeah.
we just think, it's a gender conversation. Oh, you're talking about women? No, it could be we're talking about boys in the country and their need to access economic empowerment, mental health issues that they're grappling with. So opening up the conversation, allowing men to have a stake in it, so that, and the truth of the matter is they are the carriers of instruments of power and resource. And so not having men in the conversation is a great detriment to the cause. So yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the fact that the whole idea of feminism is so toxic, it antagonizes men. They feel we don't want a part in this, you know, and it's all about changing the hearts and minds of these men to come on board to see that, no, these women are not the enemy, and we need to find a way of not just, like you said, moving from protector and provider to being partners, and how do we work together? So Irungu, how do you practically talk to these guys, sit them down and say, we need to be on board when it comes to this gender equality process, and how do we do that in terms of changing attitudes toward it?
I do probably about 50 panels, talk shows a year minimum. I always have it that it's a tremendous privilege that the opportunity to be able to share with the country views that range on all kinds of issues is not something that everybody has, and it is a privilege. But 2 weeks ago, after requesting that there would be at least a gender balanced panel, I walked onto the show and discovered that yet again we were all men. I really struggle with what to do with that, because I have tremendous respect for my anchor, my news, my moderator. I have tremendous respect for the program. It was an important issue. We were discussing leadership and the late President Moi. But it struck me that actually, this is probably what Julia Ojambo went up against when she was, in her 20s and her 30s, that she was essentially locked out of spaces. And I thought probably the best tribute that I could give to not just, the topic that we were discussing, but also just to give a statement would be to leave the panel and essentially do what I've now called demaneling. Right? And I really encourage the men to do more of this, that we really need to have a non-participation agenda in manels going forward, because I think what that will do is it will cause something to it will disrupt something. And I think, foreign delegations that meet other foreign delegations and they're only men should declare that we're going to take a recess. Please find, some women leaders to join this delegation, because we can't actually have a conversation just with men. Or if the cabinet, and we are fortunate in this country to have very powerful women in powerful positions. I mean, I think Julia from time to time thinks back and thinks, wow, a female cabinet secretary in charge of defense.
Yeah.
Right? Competent, effective, a female minister of foreign affairs. Right? These are two critical positions. The only one we're waiting for now is a president. And a deputy president. So I think we can be a bit more demanding of the spaces around us. And even in our offices, if we are called to meetings with just men, let's just declare time break. Let's, what do you call it, time out, a little break. Let's go have a cup of coffee and let's reconstitute the staff meeting so that we do have, a gender balance in these spaces.
And you just took my last question out of my mouth, which was to ask each of you, what should be a defining action moving forward when it comes to gender equality? We're in 2020, it's a new year, we're all excited about what could be. And you made a very definitive statement in not appearing on that panel. I don't know if all of us would do something like that or something as drastic, but Honorable Ojambo, what do you feel should be a defining action for 2020 when it comes to gender equality?
If it's community accepted, that we all have planned that this year we're going to say that at family level, there'll be no child left out of opportunity, be it a boy or a girl, equally. Focus is given to both. Then we start to address the gender issue. If we don't do that, it's going to continue to be gender for women. Gender conversation means women conversation. And then that way we have lost it.
Persistence is what I hear from that. Thank you so much, Honorable Ojambo.
So about 4 months ago, we were coming out of Dakar. And as we went through the immigration, I went ahead and one of my female colleagues was a bit delayed. When she caught up with me and she said to me, something really bizarre happened to me. I said, what was that? And she said, well, I was asked by the immigration officer whether I had a letter from my husband to allow me to travel to Senegal. And I was thoroughly shocked. And I suddenly got how valuable the 3 generations of women's rights struggles, what they have done to our country, that we don't need to do that anymore. In fact, it would be an illegal act on behalf of the immigration today to even ask you for a letter. Now, I know Dr. Julia will remember those days, but that is not the experience that women are going to have. Now, obviously, immigration is largely a middle-class issue. But I think what we have to recognize is that, the Matrimonial Property Act, the Protection Against Domestic Violence Act, these 2 acts didn't happen because we had good rain in 2013 and 2015. It didn't happen because of some climatic, or even, divine intervention. It happened because women and men took a decision that their societies should be much more equal, should be more inclusive. And I think what, I'm committing to, and, I hope the people out there also commit to, is creating a society in which all are safe and all are dignified.
Amazing. Kate?
Powerful. 2020, I am committing to picking up on something that Joanne said, that every generation has to pick up from where the other generation left in terms of helping move this process forward around gender equality. I have the privilege of working for one of the largest, if not the largest, organization that is focused on advancing children's rights and equality for girls. It's a privilege and an honor, especially when I get to head that in a country like Kenya. I am committing to opening up a space for a girl to sit on the Kenyan board and to help us direct the programs in a way that touches the lives of girls in very singular yet impactful ways for girls in Kenya. That's one commitment. My second commitment, and has become a pet peeve now, and I think we talked about this last time I was on your show, I am so disturbed by the teenage pregnancies in this country. It is a sore issue. It is something we are accepting as a norm, and it has a direct bearing on gender inequality. If I have to drop out to be a mother, to take care of a child when I am a child, right there the gender disparity begins. Right there I don't have the equal opportunities that a boy or a young man has. And so I think we need to address this issue. It is being swept under the carpet, and we need to tackle it head on as a nation. And it's a space that is murky, if you remember our last conversation, but somebody's got to take it on. And I know there are many like-minded organizations that want to work on this issue. So I'm committed to being part of that discussion.
Amazing. Yes. Big ticket items on that to-do list.
I might steal the first one. Is going to steal the first one.
I love it. Love it. Two is better than one. Absolutely.
Oh, wow. So inequality is expensive, and it costs us economically and in many other ways. So I think my commitment is to interrogate the socialization and the culture that surrounds gender inequality. I love a quote by Chimamanda, and she said that culture doesn't make people, people make culture. So as much as the African continent has such rich and warm culture, so we're not throwing the baby with the bathwater by any means, but we're interrogating the negative elements of the culture. And whenever culture is discriminatory, if it's repugnant to justice and morality, if it's retrogressive, we must expunge it immediately. So I think a review of interrogating every single thing that we have been taught, our socialization, things need to be done this way. That's how negative gender stereotypes begin to play, and that's how we begin to see suicides and mental health issues creeping up along the way. That's when we begin to see that certain genders don't do certain tasks like science, technology, engineering, and math. So for me, my commitment is to lead conversations and to be part of that conversation as well, where we're debunking culture and socialization and expunging anything that is not necessary, that does not push the needle in terms of this gender equality conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Honorable Ojiambo, Irungu, Kate, and Joanne, for raising some pertinent insights and issues that we need to start paying attention to now and can't afford to ignore. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And hopefully this conversation continues on social media, #CitizenWeekend. Keep it going there. And also I'd like to hear some of your commitments as well. This is one of mine, creating a space for women to have their say and to have more of a voice. Have a lovely evening. Thanks for watching.